Well,
John and I have met once. We met last year at the festival, the Bodies in the Library conference. I've spent the last 5 years just doing things I've never done before. I'm learning the game of bridge, and I started a blog, and I decided to seek out people who could look at Agatha Christie and other Golden Age writers with the same glee, zest, intellectual curiosity, whatever, as I feel I do here alone in California. And now I know that Jeff's in San Diego, so we do have to meet midway at some point, sir, and just talk and talk and talk. So I went to the conference and met John and many, many other wonderful people. We actually all went to a pub afterwards and had gluten-free steak pie. So I'm totally British now. And
not before time.
when Mike and Jackie asked us to speak, we were asked not to really plan anything. So I thought we would just start. I was going to just tell you very quickly how I met Agatha Christie. I was 9 or 10 years old, and I had a very, very wonderful babysitter named Steve Levy. He was the best of all my babysitters because instead of being crabby and making us go to bed, he would regale us with wonderful stories, usually lengthy stories told in serial form. And one night he began a saga of 10 people trapped on an island with a killer. And that went on for several visits. And when it was over, my life had changed. But I didn't know it yet. About a year later, I was in a drugstore with my mother. Is it a pharmacy in Britain? I don't know. And there was a paperback rack, and a new movie had just come out. George Pollock had directed the latest version of And Then There Were None, called 10 Little Indians. And when I started reading the back cover, I realized this was the story that Steve had told me. So I begged my mother to let me buy it. And even though it was about murder, most foul, she agreed. And that began a lifelong love affair with Agatha Christie. So I would then turn to you, John, and ask you, what was your first meeting with the great Queen of Crime?
So I first heard about Agatha Christie when I was very young, but I did not realize it at the time. I only realized in hindsight afterwards, because my parents would occasionally talk about this person who was called Ag of the Christie. Ag of the Christie, a bit like Tess of the D'Urbervilles. And I never asked who this Ag was or as to what the Christie was, but it was something that was around. It must have been mentioned a couple of times for it to have stuck in my mind. And I was very fortunate because my parents both had quite a lot of books, fiction books. We were encouraged to read. We were taken to the library to kind of borrow. So I hoovered up books from the age of sort of 7, and so I read things like the famous Five and the Five Investigators and Dog and the Hardy Boys and some of the Three Investigators and that sort of thing, and a little bit of Sherlock Holmes. And then my parents had some Agatha Christie on the shelves, and I can't remember whether I asked, can I borrow one of those, or whether my dad said, you might want to read one of these at about the age of 12 or 13. And in hindsight, again, strangely, the first book that he gave me was Why Didn't They Ask Evans, which is an odd choice. It's not one that I'd give to someone as a first Christie, but I read it, I liked it, I enjoyed it. And then I'm fairly sure that the second title, which he then said, oh, well, have a look at this, was The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. And my mind was blown. I finished that book and I was like, I don't know whether that's allowed to happen, but I like it.
It's not. Really.
And from then on, I read the rest of them that my parents had. We got some more because a friend who liked Christie was getting a nice set and gave us some more. And then I've just carried on reading since then, and then moving it into other mystery authors.
Well, I think you were lucky that your parents had some, because I don't think anybody in my community had ever heard of her. Nobody ever mentioned her. I didn't know her name. And I was on my own for many years. It wasn't until maybe 4 or 5 years later that I met someone else who read her books and found a fellow fan. But I do know that when I read And Then There Were None, and I mean, how do you improve upon that? I then went back to that drugstore and I found the rack was filled with her titles and I didn't know what to get next. So just on a whim, I picked up one called, in America, Murder in the Calais Coach. And again, my mind was blown. I didn't know that a mystery could be like that. I mean, that is, to a certain degree, a much more traditionally shaped mystery. But when we got to the end, I was sitting in a chair and I screamed. I threw that book up in the air and said, "No, this cannot be." And then I was doubly hooked. I, like you, read the Hardy Boys. I do not consider them a gateway drug to Agatha Christie. They are adventure stories with the tinges of mystery. But I did read Encyclopedia Brown to satisfy my puzzle, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with Encyclopedia Brown, but Donald Sobel wrote these mysteries for kids that were pure puzzle. And I was familiar with the three investigators. I did not hear of Enid Blyton. I did not know she was a writer until about 2 years ago when JJ informed everybody. And now I have all her books and will at some point read them. I consider that more of a gateway to someone like Agatha Christie. But yeah, I ran around looking for her books until I had them all. What would you consider your favorite? Can you name a favorite Agatha Christie title?
Yes.
I can.
A favorite, I think, to me is virtually impossible. Even picking a top 10 this week as part of the poll, you're going, well, what am I going to leave in? What am I going to leave out? I think in doing my rereading, where I've been going in publication order from the start to the end, I've read Hickory Dickory Dock last month. I think I'd kind of split the books into two, into ones that I definitely plan to read again and others that maybe I wouldn't. But I think in terms of, if I could only read one again, I think it would be Ackroyd. For me, again, partly because it was one of the first ones that I read, but even rereading it and seeing how it's put together, I think that's very special for me. And then after that, there is still a whole load of top-notch titles. I mean, The ABC Murders, that's another favourite of mine. Hercule Poirot's Christmas, maybe a little left field. A Pocketful of Rye, one of my favourite Marples, which I know some people might find a little bit out there and a little bit ludicrous, but I think that the psychology of the characters, to me, makes it believable, and also Miss Marple's emotional involvement in the story and her quest for justice. I find that very satisfying. So what about your favourite, Brad?
Last summer, I had the unique and wonderful experience of having John Curran ask me. His first question to me was, if you were trapped on a desert island with one Christie novel, what would it be? You always have to go with the first title that goes in your head. When people ask me my favorite, this title pops up. Like you, my top 10 changes every day. It changed when I sent them to Mike from what they had been a month ago. But my favorite is After the Funeral. And I think one of the reasons it's my favorite is not only is it a clever mystery, and not only does it have the greatest motive in all of the canon, but it is so fun. The readability of it is so enjoyable. So I love After the Funeral. I also love Death on the Nile. I just think Death on the Nile, toward the late 30s, she really started to show what she could do with an emotional relationship. And the trio the central trio in Death on the Nile are really powerful. I know the 30s are considered her golden age and just one hit after another, but I kind of like the books of the 40s because of their richness. Five Little Pigs is a favorite of mine because it's just character-wise so rich. And while she can trick us, and there's no trick in that one, it's just natural. There are five people that you any one of them could be the killer. And it's just so natural who the killer is. And it's so devastating. And I love A Murder is Announced. I know that was mentioned earlier. That's my favorite Marple. I love Miss Marple, but I love A Murder is Announced because it is so tricky. It is so verbal. I love verbal clues. I love her verbal clues more than her physical clues. I love reading that book and watching it now, see where she wants to trick us, where she wants to imagine that we don't read carefully enough to get it. But you know exactly what I'm talking about. Those are some of my favorite titles. Oh, and of course, Postern of Fate, because it's so brilliant. I'm checking to see
Stop
who
it.
I'm checking here to see who really reads Agatha Christie. So, no.
So are you
Sorry.
are you an active detective reader, Brad? Are you actively trying to solve the books, or were you when you read them the first time around?
I think when I read them the first time around, I was very much the active detective solver, and I was very bad at it. The one mystery I can think of that I understood the solution immediately was they do it with mirrors. That one, a certain character comes out of a room breathing hard, and I said, oh, well, they were just killing someone. Of course they're out of breath. And I knew exactly who the killer was. But most of the time she fooled me. I think part of that was because I was young when I read them. I was a teenager. But I was trying very hard. I had the character list. I looked at the maps. I wrote down the clues. I loved all the aids that Christie gave us in her work so that I could try and figure it out. And I don't know how other people feel about this, but now I'm always more thankful when I'm fooled than when I get it right. There's a certain intellectual satisfaction about getting it right, but I'd much rather have my jaw drop when, I remember reading The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, and my jaw literally dropped at the end of that one because we had been led into such a different path than where we were really meant to go. And that's one of the things she does so well. What about you? Are you a detective reader, or are you a social historian?
I'm not. I'm very much a passive reader. I don't want to solve the mystery, and therefore generally I don't try to. Admittedly, Christie, because they were the first set of detective novels that I read, I didn't know enough anyway. Even when I'm doing that, but when I'm reading now, I try not to solve books by other authors. Sometimes things drop into my head by like passing, and it's like, oh yeah, so I haven't seen that, and this isn't that, and I haven't seen these two people together at the same time. Oh, so they're the same person. One's impersonating the other, or something. That happened in a sort of recent read. But even sometimes when I'm making notes, if I'm planning to blog about a book, I write stuff down and go, oh, question mark, and then I put it aside, and I come back at the end, and that was the solution, or kind of part of the solution. But I've gone, nah. So I very much like to be fooled, and I don't kind of. I've never taken the challenge to the reader. I never sit down for like 5 minutes at that point and go, okay, what have I learned? What do I think is going to happen? Because I'd rather just be fooled and be surprised, and just have that wow moment, which I think for me is the key behind.
I would take paper and put it behind in front of the book so that I would not get to a line. I wouldn't see the final thing, because often the end of a chapter would be, and of course it was XYZ, and I did not want to have that happen to me. So I really didn't want to know till the very ending, but I did try to guess. This is a very unfair question. Poirot or Miss Marple?
I think overall Poirot, just in terms of volume, and I think more of them were written in that golden period of the 30s, because you only get the one Marple novel, The Murder of the Vicarage, and then there's a very long break, and then she brings her back later and then starts to use her more, and there's probably personal reasons for her as to why she did that. But I think if I had to take one or the other, then I think it would be Poirot. What about you?
I think they're very different. I think Poirot is a more traditional detective. The cluing is more fair. The structure is more in line with the traditional Golden Age detective story. But Miss Marple, particularly as Miss Marple moves along, her feelings about the world she lives in, the way they change, her reflections on that world are so moving to me. In A Murder is Announced, when she talks about the village and how it used to be, and now you don't know everybody, and so you're not as certain of your neighbors as you used to be, and that's extended again in The Mirror Cracked. There's something about her books that are a little more subversive. Of The Body in the Library is like it's almost a pastiche of a detective story. And for a person like Miss Marple, who you would think would be very kind of, I hate the word cozy associated with Agatha Christie. It's all said very unfairly, but you'd expect her to be cozy. And The Body in the Library turns out to be anything but cozy. It's very sordid and it's very violent. And she's not fazed by that at all. I find it an inner strength to her that's very powerful. And the whole change in A Caribbean Mystery, which was my first experience with Miss Marple, into a nemesis-like figure that then moves into Nemesis, which I don't find a strongest mystery, but in terms of a character study of Miss Marple, it's brilliant. So I wouldn't want to choose. I'd want them both. I'll give you Mr. Quinn, but I don't. If I had to choose, if I was forced to, I'd probably move toward Miss Marple, just because of as I've aged and read them over and over again, I still find something rich about people in her stories.
So what was your last reread and why, and what did you make of it on this particular reading?
Well, I reread, I've been trying to figure out how to celebrate 100 years on my blog. And unfortunately, I'm not sure how others have been dealing with the pandemic. It has wreaked havoc with my focus and my ability to read and write and think. But for a wonderful opportunity to do a podcast with Jim, I reread Mysterious Affair at Styles. And now I've just finished rereading Murder at the Vicarage because this is the 90th anniversary of that book, and we're going to talk about that too. And I find them both very interesting to compare. So those have been good rereads for me. And one of the things that really sticks with me is how much she's accused of just being a puzzle writer, and she's so much about the milieu. She's so much about the society in which she lives. It means something in her books, and it's often integral to her mysteries. It was only this reread of Styles that made me notice this is a wartime household. It's a household where people are conserving, where employees have been sacked, where all kinds of things have had to happen to make this household run smoothly during World War I. And those elements become clues within the mystery. So she's great at doing that kind of thing. What about you? What was your last reread?
So as I said, Hickory Dickory Dock was my last reread. It's one that I think I've only read once before, and it was one of the few where I saw the David Suchet adaptation before ever reading the book. And for me, the TV adaptation is stronger. Hickory Dickory Dock has this big boarding house in, and the cast of characters is just a little bit too big, really. And the TV adaptation managed to kind of cut that down to kind of some of the more important characters. So not a great mystery. It's got an interesting premise that starts from random items being stolen from a diamond ring, some other expensive stuff, to light bulbs, bicarbonate soda, I think, and various odd things that Miss Lemon's sister, who runs the boarding house, finds has disappeared. And so that kind of premise is sort of interesting. I think for me, reading it this time is the kind of is the social setting, and the fact that actually Christie does touches upon race, which in the current time now is we're still having the same conversations that some of the characters are having in the book at the time around use of language, which is very interesting there, and sort of I think Christie is certainly not based on that, against immigration from the West Indies, from the sort of colonies, because the woman who owns the boarding house, she would like to get rid of any black people staying there because she thinks that it will put off American students. And Miss Lemon's sister is very much, no, I'm not going to have that. I'm not going to let that happen. Miss Lemon, very early in the books, there's a mention that now a lot of nurses are black, but they're actually very good at being nurses, and she doesn't have a problem with that, and so that's interesting. And also a point around the use of language. Someone gets engaged, and the character says, "Oh well, she's 21, white and free," basically, and this Indian character says that's a very offensive thing to say, as if to imply that being white makes you free or something. And then this other character says, "Well, that's not what she means. That's just a phrase." And then an African character says, "Well, why say it if it doesn't mean anything, or if it, or if there's better ways to say it?" Which I think in this current time kind of spoke to me as there's lots of phrases that we use which have connotations that maybe we're not aware of. And other people say, "I'd rather you didn't say that really." And we're like, I wasn't meaning to be offensive. But if we think about it and kind of change how we speak, if it's not an important thing, or we don't mean what we say by it, then we shouldn't say it. So I think seeing a lot of the world changing through Christie has been very interesting, going through chronologically.
I think all of us who spend much of our lives exploring classic literature, classic genre fiction, early 20th century, 19th century, have to face the stuck in its time element. That's what my friends at the podcast All About Agatha call it, of these books. There are some ugly things. And I can't excuse them, but I also won't stop reading her because of them. And so I think what you're saying there makes sense in terms of using them as understanding a culture of that time. I had a wonderful conversation with a friend about this subject recently, and you learn from this. You see what people said. I think some people don't understand how casual racism and sexism were and continue to be. And to see those displayed in works of fiction and other things that you actually love, films, it makes you stop and think and see what you can do better now. I've tried to make them a learning point rather than a reason to feel more upset. There are some, Death in the Clouds has an awful moment. Between the leading man and the leading lady, and The Hollow, one of my favorite books. It's a terrible moment there too. So we have to understand this is where she came from and what she was thinking at the time. And sometimes, as I think sometimes happens in Hickory Dock, they're the points of view of characters and not her own. And that's the thing to remember as well. We could talk for a long time. I don't know if anyone else has any questions. I don't want to belabor this. I'm having too much fun.
Sorry, Brad, can I come in there? We were planning to open this up to everybody as
wonderful. I would love to hear some of the things we've brought up from others.
Sorry, Brad. Can we leave that till later, because we have got a lot to get through tonight, and what we would like to go around to everybody and ask you how you all got into Agatha Christie. We have got a lot to get into tonight, so we're just going to move on for the time being, if you wouldn't mind, and then we'll come back to